Good evening, and welcome to the second and final day of the Riley Institute's first Alumni Symposium focused on national security and civil liberties. My name is David Schei, and I used to be Furman's president long ago. People often ask me, how did you know when was the right time to retire? And as I look back to 2009, I recall two things in particular. First, in that year, I happened upon a New Yorker cartoon that showed a young boy looking up at a very tall father, and the caption read, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." And I thought, wow, I've never thought of it in that context. What prestige, what stature. The second, related to that particular period, that week, I especially liked the sound of that adjective, former president, because I learned how much smaller our endowment was in 2009 as a result of the Great Recession. The second catalyst for my decision was equally unpleasant. One afternoon, I innocently ducked into the men's room in the administration building, and I had washed my hands and went over to the hand dryer, the blow dryer, and to my shock and consternation, I saw that someone had taken the time and energy to etch into the push plate of the blow dryer the following inscription: "Press here for a word from our president." And for someone like me, who made his living by the sweat of his jaw, that was hard to swallow. So that night at White Oaks, I tossed and turned, trying to identify who might have done that dastardly deed? Who was the culprit? The next morning, still irritated, I hosted our president's cabinet meeting and I reported what had happened, and I asked which one among the dozen senior team members was responsible. After a pregnant pause, they all raised their hands, even the women. And later that day, I learned that the grounds crew had also participated and that the faculty wanted to etch the same inscription into all of the restroom dryers across the campus. So the next day, I turned in my resignation letter, and the rest is history. But I did notice the other day, President Davis has removed all of the hand dryers across the campus. So with that by way of introduction, how many of you were here last night? Wow, you get a blue star for returning. For those of you who are here for the first time, you need to know the dynamics of what's about to unfold. First, Admiral McConnell is going to speak, and then we're going to invite 4 other Furman alums in related career fields to join us for a discussion. And about that time, we're eager for you, should you have a question, to text it to us. And you can do that by looking at the bottom of your program on the first page, actually all of the pages, and at the bottom it says text your questions to 864-688-9368. So, we want you to be thoroughly engaged, and please take advantage of that. Tonight, as was the case last night, we have an equally stellar group of alumni experts to discuss what is perhaps the most compelling topic facing the United States. And to begin our program, we have the privilege of hearing from someone who was centrally engaged with the highest levels of government intelligence gathering. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has looked at this cast of characters last night and tonight and wondered, is it just a coincidence that all of the leading figures in government intelligence are Furman alums? Admiral Mike McConnell grew up in Greenville and graduated from Wade Hampton High School, a fact that is overflowing with irony, since Wade Hampton's mascot is the Generals, and Mike became an admiral. After starting at North Greenville College, he had the good sense to transfer to Furman, where he earned a degree in economics in 1967. As you may remember, some of you older folks like me, 1967 was the very peak of the Vietnam War. So he, like other college graduates that year, immediately faced the prospect of being drafted. Eager to avoid fighting in jungle heat, humidity, muck, and mire, he wisely opted for the Navy rather than the Army, only to find himself assigned to the Mekong River Warfare Riverine Center in Vietnam. After that tour in Vietnam, he got involved with naval intelligence. The Army partisans among you, I'm sure, are saying, boy, that's an oxymoron. By 1990, he had quickly risen through the ranks to become the intelligence director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During the first Iraq War in 1991, he served as director of intelligence for General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you may remember, as I do, seeing Mike in his crisp white Navy uniform giving the televised briefings during that conflict. Early in their relationship, General Powell told him precisely what he wanted from him. As an intelligence officer, he told Mike, your responsibility is to tell me what you know. Tell me what you don't know. Then you're allowed to tell me what you think. But you always need to keep those three separate. 2 years later, Mike was named the director of the National Security Agency, NSA, the largest of all the government spying agencies, whose mission is to collect and analyze data used for foreign intelligence and for counterintelligence purposes, a discipline known as signals intelligence, or eavesdropping. Mike retired from the Navy in 1996 and joined Booz Allen, a large Washington-based consulting company. But almost 10 years later, President Bush convinced him to leave that lucrative position and return to government service by becoming the second Director of National Intelligence, DNI, a position created after 9/11 to consolidate the activities of all 16 federal agencies, military and civilian, including the FBI and the CIA, any agency engaged in intelligence gathering and network protection. So that involved overseeing approximately 100,000 employees. No one knows for sure. After over 2 years in that crucial role, straddling the Bush and Obama presidencies, Mike again retired from government service. But as the DNI, he had arisen each day at 4 in the morning to give the daily dawn briefing to the president. That is why he has never been up this late in the last 10 years. We're worried about that. Mike also gave numerous briefings, both public and private, to congressional committees and individual legislators. In one of those sessions to them, he explained, I am not a policymaker, and I'm not a political figure. My job is to share the truth with as much clarity and understanding as possible. One of those hard truths he noted was that the United States is fighting every day, every night, a global cyber war, and we are losing. Among his responsibilities as DNI, Mike allocated the budgets to the 16 different entities and agencies while, as he said, ensuring that no one breaks the law. So in a nutshell, Mike McConnell has spent 30 years trying to make the country as safe as possible by providing the highest quality intelligence available while at the same time protecting the rights and privacies of the citizenry. But it's not easy. As Mike said in the New York Times in 2012, in looking at all the computer systems of consequence in government, Congress, at the Department of Defense, aerospace, companies with valuable trade secrets, we've not examined one of them yet that has not been infected by an advanced, persistent external threat. Well, to learn more about those persistent threats, please join me in welcoming to the podium Mike McConnell, a consummate professional devoted to this nation's security.
Dr. Shah, thank you so much. I've always been such a great fan. And now I understand how speakers are intimidated when they come to Furman after that introduction. I didn't want to get up. I wanted to keep hearing the story about I'm probably the oldest person in the room, if not the oldest. Gives me a prerogative. I have grandchildren. The story that Dr. Shah told last night cleared the way for one of my stories. I have two. First is easy, two granddaughters. We'd come over for an afternoon visit on Sunday. Granddad would go in, lay down on the sofa and catch a little nap. Car comes up to the front door and I hear it and they charge through the door, highly energized, run down the hall, turn the corner, coming down to the den. I'm getting up off the sofa because it's a little stiff. And the oldest of the two girls said, Granddad, make a sound like a frog. And I said, what? She said, make a sound like a frog. And I said, why? And the little one said, we're talking to Grandma. And she said, when you croak, we're going to Disneyland. It's a true story. All right, this is the one I was hesitant to tell in this environment, in this situation, because when I was here, we had chapel twice a week. We took roll, no dancing, no fun. I've heard that it's changed a little bit, thanks to leadership, Dr. Shah, Dr. Johns, and others. And he last night on this stage said sex. So I said, oh, I'm home free now. All right, where's Neil Cochran? Raise your hand. This is my friend. We went to high school, to junior college, and to Furman together. He's Pastor Neil Cochran. He's the reason for my success. We're at North Greenville, first week on campus. We're getting together as freshmen. Nobody knew anyone. He said, we've got to have class officers. And Neil said, McConnell, he ought to be one. And I got elected, and then I was president of the student body, and I never looked back. Now, Neil has married us, buried us. If he lives another 50 years, he can take care of the whole family. Now, this is a true story, and Neil will probably not remember. Two grandsons. Every time we'd come down around the springtime, spring break, I'd bring my grandsons over to Neil's church. Neil's a Baptist minister. I don't hold that against him. But if you notice, all these front rows are empty. Well, the Baptists don't sit on the front. They sit in the back. And they would sneak out the back. So Neil came up with a great idea. Put the kids down here, front row. And he'd give his sermon, he'd talk to you, he'd involve the kids. So it was just before Easter. And he is a good Baptist preacher. He's raving, he's ranting, and it's Easter season, and he's talking about the resurrection. So he's going along, and he noticed maybe a parent or two might be sneaking out the back. He said, oh, let's talk to the kids. He said, children, who among you can tell us what is the resurrection? My grandson. I said, oh, God. My grandson, they gave him a microphone. He turned around and looked at the audience. He said, Preacher Neil, I don't know what the resurrection is, but I know if you get one that lasts more than 4 hours, you better call a doctor. It took Preacher Neil about 15 minutes to get that congregation settled down. You have a wonderful piece of paper in your program. It's a brochure, civil liberties and brief primer, talking about the First Amendment, right to due process, and so on. You really need to read that. You need to think about it, because these are serious questions. And we're going to talk about this, and I'll give a little bit of background. Some of my colleagues are going to come up, Furman graduates, wonderful people, and they're going to challenge what I have to say. And I learned years ago, if you're going to meet a challenge, learned this from my Army buddies, preemption is a great move. Eli, raise your hand. Where are you, Eli? One of my colleagues right here, he is a privacy advocate. I love privacy advocates, but we were trying to get ready for this session. We're exchanging emails, and so I want to share with you what Eli said in our emails for all to see, so this is not dishonest, it's just a preemption. And here's, I quote Eli, Furman graduate of what year? 02? Remember, 66, 02, there's a big gap there. Okay. Here's what he said. As Admiral McConnell says, because I'd sort of put my position out there, as Admiral McConnell says, surveillance must be governed by law. I believe that in my heart and soul. However, always however, I think that it very much matters what the law is. I agree. Have you heard of FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act? Well, I'm going to explain that history and background in just a few moments. Eli goes on. In many ways, existing laws that govern surveillance fall short. Most broadly, surveillance needs to be subjected to public oversight, not just self-perpetuation in the hands of unaccountable public servants. I give you an unaccountable public servant. So that's where we're going to start. Let me tee this up by asking you a question. I want to make a statement first. I'm a spy. America hates spies. Love the books, like to go to the movies, not many invitations to dinner. Because as a nation, we don't like spies. Why? Every nation has spies. Most of them spy on their own citizens, attempting to keep the incumbents incumbent. Now, when our founding fathers went through the trials and tribulations of the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution, they wrote a Bill of Rights that was supposed to protect us from overreach by government. The first spy master for the United States was someone you probably heard of. His name was George Washington. Wrote his own code, recruited his own spies. But as soon as the revolution was over, got rid of all that. And every time we've been through a crisis, we're flat-footed. We're not ready. Nobody can break code. Nobody has human agents. We're just flat-footed. World War II, we don't really know what's going on in Germany. American public, we do not want to be involved. It's their war, it's not our war, it's not our problem. We're not going there. Congress is holding back President Roosevelt. Roosevelt's cutting a deal with Churchill. They're trying to work out something. Lend-lease, trying to be supportive. American public is not behind it. Remember, only the Congress can declare war. And oh, by the way, the last time that happened was 1941. So what pulled us into World War II? Pearl Harbor. Now, let's start at Pearl Harbor and talk about spying. We were flat-footed. Navy had a little bit, Army had a little bit, State Department didn't have anything. We had to invent OSS, which became later CIA. And in a partnership with the British, we were breaking Nazi Germany codes, invented what we call today computer science, artificial intelligence. A man named Alan Turing was the heart and soul and brains behind it. Churchill said after the war that this effort, led by Alan Turing, shortened the war 2 years and saved 12 million lives. We were reading Nazi Germany code so effectively that we were reading it before the German field commanders. Now, for the Germans to take that away from us, all they had to do was rotate the rotors. Did the American public have a right to know that we're breaking Nazi Germany code? It's a pretty serious question. A little more contemporary time. Before I go there, let me go to the Pacific. The Army and the Navy are arguing over who's going to break the Japanese code. The Navy wants to have a prime role. The Army wants the prime role. So whoever was making the decision said, okay, here's the answer. Navy, you do odd days, and Army, you do even days. And then you could share the result. Now, I've served in Pearl Harbor. I've talked to the survivors. I've read the books. Roosevelt did not know the Japanese were coming. He did not know. Once Pearl Harbor occurred, we were breaking Japanese code in less than 95 days. It turned the tide of battle at Coral Sea because we knew exactly what they were going to do. That is the Australian celebration of the turning point in the Pacific. More importantly, the Japanese fleet, the largest armada in the history of the world, was underway, and all we know is they're underway. We don't know if they're going to Singapore or Manila or San Francisco or back to Hawaii. We don't know because they're in a mission control. They don't talk, therefore you can't get direction finding. We have no clue. We started to break lanes of traffic in the Japanese code. A young cryptographer said, let's cause all of the targets we suspect they might be going to speak in the clear. Midway has no fresh water. The commander at Midway was instructed, tell us on an undersea cable that you're out of water, it's emergency, you have to have a tanker. And then we will monitor the transmissions from Tokyo to see did they pick up the transmission and would they talk about the likely target. Within 24 hours, message to the fleet that was underway, Target X suffering water shortage. Admiral Nimitz had his answer. He put an inferior fleet north of Midway, and when the Japanese fleet came over the horizon, they attacked, and it was a little gruesome, but effective. They attacked with torpedo planes. Every torpedo plane was shot down. Every person died, except one ensign. And the reason for attacking with the torpedo planes was to get all the Japanese airplanes up. Once they're up, they have to land. They run out of gas. When they started to land and the decks are fouled, then our bombers attacked out of the sun, sunk 3 of the large deck carriers. The 4th one eventually sunk, and then they just picked off the rest of them because they had no air defense. Did the American public have a right to know that we're breaking Japanese code? Now I'll go to a more contemporary event. 9/11 we all lived through. Almost everyone, I've met a few people here that are so young, 9/11, what was that? But anyway, most of us remember. We knew it was Osama bin Laden, he took credit, and we knew he was on the run. We were tracking him. My old organization, the National Security Agency, was tracking him. How do you do that? Pretty simple. You had a cell phone. Your cell phone tells somebody where you are all the time. Because as long as it's on, it's talking to a tower. If it's talking to a tower, it says this tower is talking to that phone, and we knew that that number belonged to Osama bin Laden. So we're tracking him toward Bora Bora. We're closing in. We're going to hold him accountable. The New York Times published, guess how they're tracking Osama bin Laden? They're doing it with a cell phone. They're tracking it through the tower. Osama bin Laden threw his cell phone away. Took us 10 years. 10 years, but we finally did it. I went back, before I go to back in the administration and working for President Bush, I want to give you a little history of spying on Americans. I grew up here. Everyone around me was intensely conservative, most of whom were bigots, and most of whom were racist, except in my home. My father was a bleeding heart liberal. He thought the greatest human being on earth was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So my growing up time was very interesting. What I saw in school and what I heard from my friends and what I heard at home were very different. So one day we're driving down, we used to call it Superhighway. It's the highway from Greenville to Spartanburg. Big sign, impeach Earl Warren. I said, Dad, who's Earl Warren? He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I said, well, why would we want to impeach him? He said, well, there's a court case that's gone to the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education, over the argument of integration as opposed to segregation. And some believe that the Chief Justice is going to lead to a decision that says that segregation is inappropriate and unlawful, and we have to integrate. And then later on, I always remembered that. I did the history. The other swing vote was Justice Black from Alabama, a former member of the KKK, who had changed his view and become enlightened and said, no, segregation is wrong. We need to integrate. So J. Edgar Hoover, without a warrant, tapped the telephones of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Justice Black because he said they were engaged in un-American activities. No warrant. When I found that, I was upset. Now, I'm a product of the Vietnam era. I did go. I was in the Riverine Force. I missed some of the turbulence here in the protests. I came home. I was assigned back out to the Pacific, but I had to go through Washington, so I'm dressed in my uniform, and I walked down the street in Washington, D.C., and people spit on me. That made me more determined to stay the course, and what I had determined then was what I believed to serve my country. What I found out in that period is the U.S. Army and the CIA and NSA was spying on Americans who were anti-war protesters. That went through the Johnson administration and went to the Nixon administration. And the Nixon, who won, was so paranoid that he now wanted to use this apparatus to find out more about the Democratic National Committee. Sound like history repeats itself? So you know the story. He broke in, they got caught. Now we're on Capitol Hill, and I'm an observer. Church, Pike. Church in the Senate, Pike in the House. They said, look, this will never happen again. We're going to pass laws and regulations about how to do this and when to do it and what's appropriate and so on. And that law was called FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978. The dilemma was we had a nation state called the Soviet Union who had already banged on the podium at the United Nations saying, we will bury you, domination of the world by communism as opposed to democracy and free markets and so on. And so the Congress said, you know, we got to do this spying stuff. How do we govern it? So we made pretty simple rules. If it's foreign, it's legal. If it's domestic, it is illegal. However, the United Nations is in New York. Embassies are in Washington. They are agents, they are members of a foreign government or agents of a foreign power. Said, okay, all right, NSA, you got to do a little looking around domestically, but we're going to govern this. Can't do it without a warrant. If you're going to tap the telephone of the Iraqi ambassador in New York, and we're at war with them, and we want to know what their dialogue is from Baghdad to the United Nations ambassador, we had a legitimate responsibility to tap that telephone. Couldn't do it without a warrant. Legitimately so. It keeps us from looking at something we shouldn't be looking at. Now, FBI on the other side would only do it in the case of violation of law for which they had probable cause. The intelligence community only had to show it's a foreign power, agent of foreign power. Pretty clear divide. That served us well. I went back into the administration, got up to speed again on the terrorism issue. Here's what I faced. Terrorism in Pakistan, talking to a terrorist in Pakistan, talking to a terrorist in Turkey. And the discussion is 2 facilities are going to blow up in Germany, one U.S. and one German. Where did we get access to that information? California. The world changed. All of that Nazi Germany code intercept, all that Russian intercept, all that Japanese intercept, all in the past was wireless. Think of there are 2 kinds of communication. Wireless, there is no wire. It's transmitted through the atmosphere, line of sight or HF that bounces off the ionosphere, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden, this little thing called the internet, a little thing called fiber optics, it was free and cheap and effective for a terrorist to sit in Pakistan to talk to a terrorist in Turkey using Yahoo Mail. Another dilemma that the president had is known terrorists in Yemen calling into the United States. Now, we're targeting that phone. We can't control who it calls. Today we would describe that if he called an American as incidental. So as an intelligence officer, what I have to report is this known terrorist called this number in Chicago, and I report it out as U.S. Person 1. I don't tell anybody who it is. I just said, known bad guy called this number. Legally, what do we have to do? Now, there's a legitimate foreign intelligence reason to know who'd he call. Is it some guy calling home to talk to the grandmother about having a birthday party for a relative? Or are they talking about a cake that's special that they're going to deliver to the Sears Tower for an unexpected surprise, which might be code for blowing something up? So the FBI say, who is it? Because we had masked the identity of the U.S. person, called U.S. Person 1, maybe U.S. Person 2, or whatever it was, but we don't identify it. So the FBI says, we need to know. So we have to go through a very deliberate process to say, okay, you have a need to know, meets our criteria, here's the identity. What does the FBI do? They have to get a warrant. It's a U.S. person. U.S. persons are protected in the extreme. So you go to a judge, either in the criminal judge or to the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, and you present your case, and you either get a warrant or you don't. Remember, 3 articles of the Constitution. Article 1's of Congress, appropriate money, tell you how to spend it, oversee the executive branch. Article 2, the executive branch, which executes functions of government, protects the country. Article 3 is judicial. They have to oversee to make sure it's consistent with our Constitution and our laws. So I go back, President Mike, you used to be the director of NSA, I don't understand all this stuff, do the right thing. That was my guidance, do the right thing. Because to try to get that communication in California, I had to have a warrant. That fiber optic cable could carry trillions of bits, billions of phone calls. These terrorists are smart. 28 email addresses, 342 email addresses. Throw away a device just so they could communicate through a free system that was effective. I couldn't keep up. We couldn't get warrants for that kind of volume. I said, Mr. President, we need to change the law. What the law needs to say, so long as it's a foreign target talking to another foreigner in a foreign country, it shouldn't matter where we intercept it. There shouldn't be a requirement to get a warrant to ask Yahoo to give us access to that communication. He said, you're right. Go change the law. Both houses had switched because they're all opposed to his policy. You can debate whether we should have been in Iraq or not in Iraq, but we were there. You could debate whether going into Afghanistan was the right thing or wrong thing, but we're there. And you can debate the rights of terrorists, but we had to deal with it. And they were constantly trying to find a way to repeat 9/11. So I went to the Hill and I briefed every member of the House and the Senate publicly. And I said to them many of the things I just said to you about how we do this. And if I'd have said that 10 years earlier, it'd have put me in jail. But now I'm the DNI. I'm not above the law, but at least I can speak with some authority that the old rules served us well. We were breaking Nazi Germany code, and also well in the Cold War. But the rules today need to be reevaluated because the world has changed so dramatically. So I made my case, probably the hardest thing I've ever done. I was accused of being un-American. I was accused of being a fascist. I was accused of, well, I better leave the rest of it aside. Got pretty ugly. And I just stood there and said, we're trying to protect the country so that your children can be safe when they go to school. And we want to do it consistent with the law, and we want the law to define the rules consistent with technology and how technology's changed. And that logic prevailed. Was it 1 or 2?
10.
I got 10 minutes. Man, I'm on a roll here. So I got a couple of allies, liberal Democrats, as a matter of fact. And once they understood it and we worked through it, we were able to get the law changed. So I would make the case spying, espionage, is responsibility of every sovereign government because you don't know what's going on over the horizon. You have to do some level of spying. There's 2 kinds of spying. There's traditional espionage, how many tanks, how many missiles, How big is the army? What's the war plan? What's the political leadership intending to do? And those are legitimate questions that every sovereign state wants to know about another sovereign state or a potential enemy, given that they could impose some harm on the sovereign state, its citizens, or its interest. So I would argue that that's not a right, but a responsibility of effective government. Now, there's another kind of spying. It's called economic espionage. Let's go steal the other guy's trade secrets, source code, business plan, technology. The United States doesn't do that. We're a free market system. It's a basic question. If we stole it, if we heisted it, who would we give it to? Let's say we got some fantastic information about the next generation aircraft, special military aircraft. Would we give it to Boeing, or the old Northrop Grumman, or Lockheed, or a new startup that's just going to build from a fresh scratch? We don't know how to do that. So a decision was made when the national leadership figured out how good we are at doing this. And oh, by the way, just so you know, there isn't a computer on the globe. There isn't a computer on the globe that can't be penetrated with persistence and sophistication. So when they figured out years ago how good we are at doing this, they said espionage for economic reasons is off the table. So we took it off the table. Now, about 80% of the world's economic espionage is committed by China. They have broken into every computer system of consequence in the nation. And the intent is to extract intellectual capital so they can leapfrog your country to catch up with the rest of the world. And from their point of view, I may have the same policy. They were subjected to being behind in the industrial age. The rest of the world treated them rather harshly. The Japanese were incredibly cruel and brutal, and they're trying to catch up. So I can understand their rationale, but what are we as a nation? We are a creative, inventive, entrepreneurial nation. That's our value proposition. When I reached back and had my phone here earlier, now if you're 20 or less, what I'm going to say makes no difference. But if you're 25 or older, you remember when we didn't have that stuff? We didn't have the internet and Google and Wikipedia and phones and calendars and pictures, and changed the world. Absolutely changed the world. And we continue to do that. One of my absolute heroes of all time is Judge Green. Ruled over the suit to break up AT&T because AT&T was a monopoly. And as soon as AT&T was broken up, you had competition. When I was a youngster, when I was going to this institution, my family was not allowed to own a telephone. It belonged to Ma Bell. They'd let you use it, but you couldn't own it. As soon as it was broken up, I'll never forget, actually it was in the Japanese started making telephones. You could buy one. It was cheap. Plug it in the wall and it worked. And then the next invention came along, and then personal computers, and then Microsoft figured out a way to make it easy for us all to use. And that youngster from, I think, Indiana said, this is hard. This thing called Matrix from the DARPANET is too hard for the average person. Let's call it World Wide Web. That happened in 1992. That's when I was at NSA. The whole world changed. Now, what's happened to us as a nation since? We are absolutely dependent on digital technology. The easiest thing for everybody to understand is money. Everybody understands money. I don't care if you're 15 or 85 or as old as Dr. Shai. How much or what is the size of the U.S. economy? We're the largest economy in the world. In 10 years, we won't be. The Chinese will be. Right down today, we're the largest economy in the world. And the world does its business in one of these. Now, what's the inherent value of that piece of paper? I would say the only value is we all agree it has value. It's a unit of measure. That's all it is. It's a unit of measure. Economics 101, right in that first class building over there, that opened the world for me to make me say, yeah, money. It's just because we agree, it's a unit of value. Size of our economy is somewhere between 17 and $18.5 trillion a year. Now I want to say that number again, $18.5 trillion a year. So get the number, trillion, and get the time, year. How much money is cleared through the global banking system every business day? Remember now, the world's largest economy is 17 plus billion a year. How much goes through the banking system every day? Most of you, unless you study economics or finance or whatever, will be surprised to learn that that number is $13 trillion a day. A day. So you got economy that's measured in terms of a year, but every business day, $13 trillion goes through the system. How could that happen? New technology, clearing it at the speed of light. 30 milliseconds from Tokyo to New York. 30 milliseconds, 31 thousandths of 1 second. You can have a transaction to move $10 billion. Where's that money cleared? Half of it's cleared in New York City. 80% of that half's cleared by one bank. What happens if you have no money in your bank account? Life gets kind of difficult, doesn't it? Can't pay your tuition, can't pay your mortgage. What does Furman do if you can't pay your bills? What happens if you can't buy gasoline at a gas station? Because it's all based on confidence. That dollar has no value other than we believe it has value. And as long as that integrity of the dollar is protected, it works. So if I was Osama bin Laden or ISIL or whoever, and I wanted to do strategic damage to this country, rather than try to fly another airplane into a building, I'd figure out where half of that money is cleared and which bank clears 80% of that one half, and I would contaminate the money supply. I wouldn't even have to destroy it. I just have to contaminate it, like change every 15th zero to a 1. Because what happens when Tokyo sends 10 billion and New York says, I'm ready for your 10 billion, and Tokyo says, I've sent it, and New York says, got it, here's your receipt. That's a 1 second transaction. As soon as it doesn't happen once, everything stops. Because now nobody knows. I'm using money because it's easy, or I've found it's easy for most people to understand and appreciate, gosh, what happens if no money in the bank and my stocks aren't of value and I can't depend on it and so on. But that is repeated in telecommunications and transportation and electric power. We are tremendously vulnerable. There are nation states that are penetrating our systems and taking whatever they want. There are criminals who are stealing on the margin. I would say it's on the margin because I'll just use credit cards. Fraud in credit cards, about 1/10 of 1%. That's billions, but it's 1/10 of 1%. That's a rounding error. It doesn't really make that much difference. Nation states could, but we'd know who it is, and we'd go back and retaliate. Here's what I worry about. Can you think of a group out there that might engage in suicide bombing? That would not be deterred, given they understood and had the capability? So at some point, because you can put these things in a cell phone or a laptop and take them around the world, and they won't be detected because it's software, it's not explosive. As soon as they figure that out at some point, then I think we're going to have to face an attack on our critical infrastructure in some way. Now, my community knows these bad actors, and we're doing everything we can to figure out who they are and whatever they are. And you get a guy like Snowden comes along, and some say he's a hero, and some say he's a villain. I'm on the villain side. Because he said, oh, these guys are spying on Americans. Metadata, already been ruled by the Supreme Court. It's no expectation of privacy to collect metadata. So the interpretation of the rules, the way they're written, and I'm sure we'll have a response to this point of view later on, was the national authorities, supervised by a court, said, if those terrorists are calling in the United States, allow us to collect the phone records, the metadata, not the identity of the person, not the content of the call, but what number called what number, for what period of time, and what date. Put it in a database. So later on, if that call comes from Yemen or Pakistan, And now we're worried. We can look in the database and say, oh, he called Chicago. Well, who'd Chicago call? Well, L.A. and Houston. Think the FBI would be interested? Mr. FBI, we got a known terrorist who's affiliated with cyber terrorism talking to someone in Chicago who's talking to someone in L.A. and Houston. Do you want that information? FBI say, you got it. Give me that information. I have now suspicion, if not probable cause. They would go to a court, present their evidence on the FISA side, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and say, we have a case here to understand if these are acting as agents of a foreign power, which is legitimate in the eyes of the law, and they take a look. That's what Snowden compromised. Now, you can argue one way or the other, right thing, wrong thing. Ironically, the Congress got in an uproar. They changed the law. We now have more access to more metadata than we did earlier, but that's sort of as an aside. You can argue whether the law is right or the interpretation of the law is right, but there's no classified law in the United States. It's all in the public record. It's all part of the congressional record. It's all available for any American to see. Now, there are classified things. I started with a classified situation that was a dilemma. We're breaking Nazi Germany code and winning the war. As a citizen, do you demand to know that? Because if you do, then the Nazis would know and they would take it away from us. That is the moral dilemma for guys like me to protect sources and methods. And it's always a challenge to make sure we respect the law, we respect the rights and privileges and privacy of American citizens, and we go to extremes to do that. But some would say we're unaccountable public servants. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, we have a distinguished group of panelists who have joined us, and you will see in your programs brief biographies of all of them. And remember, if you have a question, please go ahead and text it to that number in your program. But in the meantime, I want to ask our four panelists, what within Admiral McConnell's remarks has stimulated your own thinking about these very complicated, nuanced issues? Mike?
Well, I didn't live through this as intimately as Admiral O'Connell did, but I was part of the intelligence community that was subject to these laws and debates. And it struck me at the time that, as Admiral McConnell said, we were at a distinct disadvantage with regard to what our adversaries were capable of. Our hands were tied by archaic laws that hadn't kept up with the threats. When the nature of some of those techniques that we had developed were revealed by Edward Snowden, that to me was shocking and really put into focus the issue of what we're trying to talk about in these 2 days. What's the balance between our security and our privacy? I thought then, and I think now, my thinking hasn't evolved a lot on this, but exposure to this forum has given me even more nuance that I had when I was part of the community, that this is something that individuals don't get to decide on their own. This is something that, okay, let's debate it as a society, let's debate it in the chambers of the legislature, but an individual, for whatever motivation, can't just unilaterally decide, I think I know what's best here in terms of secrecy versus privacy.
Mike Roosevelt, if you haven't figured it out, was a 30-year CIA veteran, and to his everlasting credit, he and his wife have decided to retire to the upstate. To what extent have the disclosures made by individuals who have had access to top secret data or metadata truly hurt the capacity of the agencies, whether it's Snowden or the others?
The thing, when I retired from the agency a little over a year ago, honestly, and I didn't have a need to know the details, the up close and personal details, but what I was hearing from my friends who were familiar with the investigation was they had no idea what the extent was. The assumption was it was catastrophic, but they couldn't tell how extensive, how catastrophic it was. But anytime something like this happens, whether it's the exposure of classified data by someone like Snowden or a traditional espionage case that we saw a lot of in the 80s and 90s, those are capabilities you'll never get back. Those are capabilities that before that no one knew about, and now everyone knows about them, so they're for all intents and purposes, useless.
Mike, what have you seen?
I would just offer, I'm still on the inside, and I get to talk to people who are running systems and so on, and the way they sum it up, it's the greatest and most significant damage to the U.S. intelligence community in our history. The targets that we track, we're looking at, you pick your target, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever. They just started changing their modes and started to use encryption and try to do a variety of things, which introduces something that I think this audience needs to think about and debate. The case I built for economic espionage and literally taking what I think is our life's blood can be significantly addressed with ubiquitous encryption. Now, what do you think the FBI thinks about that? Because, go back to the San Bernardino shooter and opening the iPhone. Whoa, we can't give sanctuary to criminals. I would argue here that we're in a situation, what is the greater public good? I would argue the greater public good now, as we have a system that we depend on that's secure and dependable and unassailable for the future. When I was at NSA in the early 90s, we convinced ourselves, and this is something I've learned over the years, every large organization will choose failure over change. We convinced ourselves we're going deaf with public key encryption. That's another subject. We used to do secret key, and public key came along, and we're losing control, and we're going deaf. So we introduced an idea called escrowed key. We thought it was fine. Unbreakable encryption, escrowed key, use it, but we'll escrow the key, so if we've got a legitimate reason for it, we'll go to a court, draw the key, we could do our mission. It made good sense. We lost that debate. Industry pushed back, the privacy community pushed back. The White House community, after they listened to all the debates, said, no, you guys, no export controls on encryption, and you're not winning this debate. NSA, from that point on, did better signals intelligence than any time in their history, because we had to think differently. It reminded me of Winston Churchill in World War II. When they're out of capability and out of money and out of musicians, he said, well, men, I guess we're going to have to think. And that's what we did. We said, well, we lost this fight. We've got to think. So we devised a new set of protocols and processes, and we did fine. I think the FBI can do that if they're living in a world of ubiquitous encryption.
Jessica Taylor is here representing the media, having had a precociously distinguished career with mainstream news organizations. To what extent, from your perspective as a journalist, have these issues arisen in your newsroom?
I think that, for the vast majority of my career, we have been at war. We have been dealing with the balance of how much to reveal, what is in the national security interest. I mean, any good newsroom goes through, I think, these conversations. And, as a journalist, I think I'm always going to be on the side of, I think the public has a right to know things, certainly, about what is happening. But I also think that, journalists and, we're concerned about national security as well, because it affects us, it affects our jobs, it affects journalists overseas. And, so when we are, talking about, how to balance information, it's a difficult thing. And, I've talked to some of my colleagues that have, quite a bit more experience in having to make these decisions. I've covered primarily American politics, but, and I, I'll transition just to say a little bit too. I've been struck by how the public perception of this has evolved over time. Right after 9/11, we had sort of a rally around the flag moment. There was broad support for do whatever you have to do in a way. This is when we saw the Patriot Act come into effect, and I think, just broad support. One electoral thing I was actually looking at today for a different story. Midterm elections, for example, the president's party typically loses seats. The one time that has not happened was in 2002, right after 9/11 and President Bush. And I think you saw broad support of that, but as we go into more wars, and as Admiral McConnell was talking about, whether or not you should be there or not, you are there. You're beginning to see human consequences, and the support eventually begins to wane. And if you don't have an event, and I'm certainly not saying, God forbid, that there were another event like 9/11, it sort of begins to fade from public consciousness, sort of why you need these things. You can have lone wolf attacks or many things, and I think that to a large extent the public, because cyber attacks and things fly so much under the radar, and I think it's very hard for the average American to sort of think about that you could see China or Russia or trying to make these different intrusions. I think they just see reports and different things and say, I don't want people spying on me. I don't want these things happening. When by and large, if they are law-abiding Americans, they sort of have nothing to hide. And so I think, you've certainly seen a divide within the Republican Party on this. I think that's why you've seen sort of a rise of a libertarian wing in the party and a divide over what to do that, over how to deal with that. But, it's been something that I think, as we cover news stories, is certainly something that we have to balance the national security, but I also think that it's something that has evolved in the minds of voters as well as we've gone on.
Maurice Owens has been jumping through hoops much of his life. He had the good sense to transfer to Furman from Clemson, played basketball there and here, and then entered the Air Force. And one of his assignments as an Air Force officer was to be a part of the Situation Room in the White House, where all of the key figures converge to discuss either emergencies or to plan for emergencies or discuss significant global events and domestic events. What was that like?
What was that like? Experiences that pretty much shaped the way I live my life as far as attention to detail, understanding that a lot of things that are important to the safety of the nation relies on someone like myself and someone who's next to me, and double-checking and triple-checking and using that two-person integrity on a lot of items that we would handle. And in the room itself, in my opinion, is a room where the president decides on the fate of many, many ordeals for the United States as well as the global community. So I understood the importance of the room, and I understood that the room was a vehicle and an opportunity for the United States to get it right amongst their leaders who would decide on those things. So it was an experience I would never, ever forget, and I'm glad I was able to experience.
And tell the audience what you're up to now.
What I'm up to now, I run a D.C. office for a business group. It's a Greek-English family. It's a private-owned company. But the ethos of the company is to empower the underdog, those who've been oppressed in some way, to empower young people and to empower women. So it was an easy place for me to land after leaving such an impactful place such as the White House. And for me, it's been a true blessing to be able to do things in that space where I work for a company that's very robust. We have 30 subsidiaries in 35 countries, and we're in 6 industries. We're in shipping, we're in aviation, we're in real estate, we're in hospitality, and we're also in a diversified space. But along those businesses, 30 subsidiaries in 35 countries, we have 10 social programs, and they all happen out of some form of anger that was channeled to do something right and give voice to those who normally would be voiceless. So for instance, my CEO sits on the board of My Brother's Keeper, which is an initiative to give ladders of opportunity for young people of color, young boys and men specifically. We have a new venture called Home Project, where we're building, currently 2 are already built, but we're building 5 new shelters in Greece, refugee camps, refugee shelters for kids, unaccompanied minors, also known as kids, to have a safe haven and to be able to prosper and find a way in a very, very carnage state of affairs where these young individuals are given opportunities for education and food and hospitality and just given a chance to be believed in.
Before you put the microphone down, what was it like coming from the Bronx to South Carolina?
It was a culture shock. I had to learn how to enunciate because the Bronx has a lazy way of talking in a way, and then Southern twang, I say, is also something I had to learn how to understand as well. So it was a culture shock in the language barrier, but it was also just new for me because there were some nuances of bigotry and racism, and just the true word of being ignorant, not calling anyone ignorant, but the true word of not knowing what you don't know, right? So my introduction to the Southerner and their introduction to the New York kid was a learning experience for both parties, where I wanted to dispel some narratives that are out there about young boys and men of color, and I had an opportunity about being that representative. So I immediately understood my duty in that role, and I had the opportunity to be a Furman and learn that there's opportunity in spaces and places and things, because you have to think that kids in the Bronx and kids in other inner city and rural neighborhoods as well don't have the opportunities that are afforded to someone who has that pathway to Furman. So when I got here haphazardly, I discovered a new world of opportunity that I took full advantage of, and I'm sitting with you today and the panel here today because of some of those experiences I've had at Furman to be exposed and given opportunity. That led to who I am.
We love your hybrid accent now. It's unique. Eli Dourado has, until a few weeks ago, been spending time at George Mason University in Northern Virginia, not far from D.C., focused on cybersecurity issues and also private freedoms. More recently, he's gone in a very different direction that some of us are excited about. He's already agreed to let us fly in the first flight of the next supersonic passenger jet that he's developing to succeed the Concorde. And we appreciate the discount, 70% discount?
It's a $200 million plane. We'll give you $1 million off.
That's great. We're done. Eli, tell us about what you were doing related to this symposium before you shifted into airplane design.
Yeah, so the last 5 years I've been at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University doing policy research on technology policy issues. My remit was quite broad, and I was able to work on whatever I wanted to work on. My training is as an economist, and so I brought that lens to it. And I worked a lot on cybersecurity policy, on internet freedom, international telecom regulation. I advised the State Department, traveled with the State Department to international treaty conferences, and helped to negotiate treaties that affected international telecommunication. And so I definitely have a sensitivity to how, in the midst of this work, the revelations of surveillance undermined our internet freedom message as a country, and caused a lot of governments that were to call us hypocritical. That we were preaching internet freedom out of one side of our mouth, and then out of the other side, we were saying, well, it's really okay if we're spying on innocent people, both in the U.S. and around the world.
And to what extent are you more or less confident about the ability of America to manage these very complex, nuanced, ambiguous issues and boundaries?
They are nuanced issues. That's the thing that I think is really important to take away. I think if you have a good versus evil story when you think about these issues, you're deluding yourself. You're not actually. You're actually maybe lowering your IQ by 10 points or more as you think about this. So the unaccountable public bureaucrats, many of them are very good people. They're very honorable people, and I think they're doing a good job. But the question is, to what extent should the public know about not individual sources and methods, but the scale of the kind of surveillance that we're doing? And I think it's evident that through the Snowden revelations, again, like, don't have a good versus evil story about Mr. Snowden. You know, it's some of both. To what extent? To the extent that people were surprised about that, you know, I think about just the scale. I think people probably had a right to know that there was something of that scale going on.
Mike Roosevelt and I shared a professorial mentor at Furman, a professor in the history department who taught Soviet history when we were students. And what Mike didn't realize, although I knew when I was a student, is that our shared mentor was a former CIA analyst. Talk a little bit about Bill Lavery and the way in which he directed you into this field, if he did.
Well, what can I say about Bill Lavery that hasn't been said? The impact that he had on me, by the time I took his course, I was about 90% certain that I was going to major in history. And by the time I was about 2 weeks into his course, I was 100% certain that I was going to major in Russian history. He had a way of bringing history to life and making it real for his students, making it exciting, making it funny when it was funny. Sometimes history is just stupid and funny, and he acknowledged that. It wasn't just dry dates and names and places. It was a big adventure for him, and he made us part of it.
And share with the audience something I think few of them would know about. How does one get into the CIA?
They tap you on the shoulder. You never know it's coming, but somebody just reaches out and taps you on the shoulder. In my case, I got into the CIA by being on the brink of being a failed PhD student at Indiana University. I was just fed up with the academic life and knowing deep inside that I needed to do something else. And my wonderful wife, Jane, who has bailed me out on many occasions, not literally, but figuratively. But if it came to literally, she would, right? Came home to lunch one day and she said, CIA is going to be recruiting next week on campus. And as I was saying, you can be a little naive at times. I showed up at the event, which was for linguists, not me. I got to the head of the line. I confessed immediately to the two recruiters, one of whose name was Peter Gunn. I'm not making that up. He may have been making it up, but I'm not making it up. And I told them that I was a student of Russian history, and they said, please sit down. Because we were in the middle of the Reagan hiring binge, and a year later, I was a CIA officer being sworn in.
No test?
Oh, big test. Lots of tests. Several interviews, including a trip up to Chicago to meet with a retired spy, a legitimate spy, whose name was John Hopkins. Again, I'm not making it up. Who literally asked me that if I were ordered to kill someone, would I? I think that was a test. We took the CIA's equivalent of the SAT in a Bloomington high school, myself and several others, and I kept getting calls. Things have changed a lot in the 35 years since then, but I would be walking into my apartment totally randomly, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock, whatever, and as soon as I walked in the door, the phone would ring. This would be months and months apart. And a disembodied voice at the other end of the line would say, this is Bob in Washington. We need to schedule you for an appointment. How does June the 5th, whatever, sound? Yeah, and it's like, what? Who, what, Bob? And so I came to DC for a week of more tests, lots of interviews, the polygraph. Once you pass the polygraph, it's sort of, you're almost home free. Then it's just a background investigation. But I had a pretty boring life in that regard. So,
Mike, well, we all realize that you are constrained by various confidentiality issues and protocols. But to the extent you can, share with the audience, in a general sense, what is going on 24 hours a day in terms of eavesdropping?
It's global. It's extensive. It was revealed by Snowden that we were eavesdropping on the Germans. The context of that is we were attempting to arrange a nuclear agreement with the Iranians. The country in the world that supplies most of Iranians technology and equipment from the Western world, which they're desperate for, happens to be German. So one of the questions is, it was the Perm 5+1, as I recall. The +1 was Germany. So the question was, are the Germans with us or not? And so they were targets, so to figure out, as we go to the mat on this, can we count on the Germans being there? Because the German business communities put intense pressure on the government to not go too far, because it's going to cut off the market. And oh, by the way, if we got to an agreement, that means other countries could provide supplies or equipment or whatever to Iran. It'd be a stiffer competition. So the Germans, once Snowden revealed that we were doing what we were doing, were very mad at us. Now, there's something that the audience needs to appreciate. There is first party, that's the United States, the United States only, and we handle that information as no foreign, I mean, we don't share it with anyone. There's second party, which means the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That's a result of World War II, where we were sharing, breaking Japanese code and the Nazi Germany codes. And so we're partners, and we share it about the probably 99% level in the signals intelligence community. And then there's third party. A third party is a partner. We've agreed to share information on whatever we've agreed to target collectively. And it was very easy in the Cold War because it was always a third party partner. We're working against the Soviet Union. But there are also third parties for other reasons, and I just framed the issue here, why Germany, and it was the issue, are they with us or not? So the Germans were very, very upset with us and came to state their case, and we handed them back their collection list because they had inadvertently given us their collection list. Number one on the list was the President of the United States. So as I said earlier, every nation state conducts espionage. That's what we do. We want to know. Now, it's pretty easy against us because of the free press, and that's part of who we are. And if you just read being out of the community, I read through 3 newspapers every day. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a little bit of AP and a little bit of Reuters and a little bit of Bloomberg. I don't miss anything going on in the world. I've tested that on 3 different occasions where I totally divorced myself from the classified world and just read the press. I didn't miss very much. Yeah, a little bit around the edges. We are a very well-informed public. So the question with us is they can target us, and they do, or they can just read the newspaper or just talk to us. So a lot of the fuss was, if you want to know from the Germans, why didn't you just ask them? We did, but if you're negotiating a nuclear agreement and there's a business interest, you want to know for sure. That was the issue.
Well, you answered my follow-up, which is, yes, whenever it's revealed that we are spying on someone or they are spying on us, there is an initial indignation, and yet it disappears rather quickly.
Quickly, yes.
Is that because everybody's spying on everybody?
That's exactly right.
All right, well, let's take a concrete example. General Mulholland, who was with us yesterday, had to go back today. Are his communications being monitored by other nations?
But depending on what he's doing. Right now, no, they don't care.
But when he was...
oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, well, now he's not in a position to have any activity with impact.
But military figures,
no,
leaders.
No, not really. You'd have to have some official capacity where... I was a target once, big target, but now nobody cares. I mean, he's just an old windbag going down to Furman. Nobody listens to him. So now there's a target sitting right there. I guarantee you. He leads
this guy, yeah.
15, 17,000 troops around the world conducting important missions. So no, I can tell you he's a target because he's on active duty.
Well, let's get to the question of this admittedly difficult balancing act on privacy and surveillance. Eli, do you think that the Admiral preemptively addressed your concerns?
No, I was honored to be quoted by Admiral McConnell, but But I do think that the law as it exists goes too far to allow surveillance. And one example of that is if we look at the dual mandate of the NSA. So one mandate of the NSA is to conduct signals intelligence, and another mandate is to create information assurance. And the NSA has a very important information assurance mission. And to some extent, those two missions are in tension, particularly as it relates to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So when the United States discovers a new vulnerability, it can either try to fix that vulnerability so that it can't be exploited, Americans' systems can't be exploited, or it can try to weaponize that vulnerability so that it can be used to collect signals intelligence. And so while I agree that spying is necessary and that we do spy on other countries, and I don't think it's inappropriate to spy on the Germans on occasion, and I said so at the time that was revealed, I do think that we have to protect Americans in the cyber domain to a much greater degree than we currently are through responsible disclosure of those vulnerabilities, even if it means that at some margins we'll get a little bit less signals intelligence.
And who's responsible for generating those protocols?
Admiral McConnell could answer better than me, but there's a process known within the government called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process, which brings together different agencies to sort of evaluate the severity of the vulnerability and make a decision about whether or not to disclose it or to weaponize it. And I would argue that process has been tilted a little too far. And some others in the former members of the intelligence community have said the same, that it's tilted too far in the direction of offense and not far enough in the direction of defense.
The argument inside NSA from my time and forever was called the equities debate. NSA, it does have two missions: break the code of foreign entities so we can know what they're doing, and make the code and ensure information assurance for U.S. classified information. It's illegal for NSA to do anything with unclassified information or with private sector information. That's captured in law in 1986, because Congress was worried about that. So the debate for most of the time through the wireless world and before the internet was done inside NSA. As a result of some of the disclosures and the debate and the dialogue, the president decided we better move that process in the White House. So it is done inside the White House. It's not a National Security Council meeting, but representatives of all the National Security Council members, state, defense, commerce, treasury, whoever, meet, and their experts have a dialogue and a debate. NSA has discovered a flaw that allows them to get access to ISIS leadership communications. And they've examined the situation to determine this is so secure and so remote, it's never been discovered, and we think we can protect it and continue to exploit it. Do you, rest of government, think this is that important that we should not disclose it? So that's the decision that will be taken. Now, particularly with the Obama White House, the presumption was you would decide in favor of disclosure. Now, one other thing I'd like to draw out for this audience to think about, one of the things that Snowden caused was significant damage to U.S. business. Because what he painted a picture, big story on something called PRISM. The accusation was PRISM was an automated system that connected to all email systems and sucked out information. That's partially true. It was an automated system that was attached to email systems, but it only took legitimate, previously identified and established targets of foreign targets, no U.S. information. But it was painted as automatic collection from all the email providers. Instantly, the U.S. technical community started to feel impact of that. And then the competition in foreign countries said, oh, see, you can't trust those Americans. You gotta buy German, buy Italian, buy Japanese, whatever it was. And so that had pretty big impact. I want to make one other point. Clausewitz 101, the great theoretician on warfare. 3 kinds of power. military power, political power, and economic power. And the first two are derived from the last one. So part of our responsibility as national security officials is to protect the U.S. industrial base the best way possible. And so part of this debate today over do we disclose or not disclose, if we're reading ISIS leadership communications, is that something we want to preserve? And oh, by the way, if we disclose things that would potentially harm business, are we all impacting national security in another direction? So it's very complex. The Obama White House, who, remember, candidate Obama was 1,000% against FISA until he realized he might win. He said, whoop, 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 not so fast, and FISA turned out to be probably 75, 80% of the intelligence information that we've gathered on terrorist groups for the last 15 years.
Are you allowed to give us some sense of the scope of the number of warrants that are requested each year?
Warrants
for surveillance?
Let me
of
do
American citizens?
Let me do the equities thing. The equities thing, well, I'll do it in a couple of sequences. Unmasking, U.S. person identified by two foreigners talking or a foreigner talking to a U.S. person, maybe 600 in a year.
And how many are turned down by a judge?
A judge would not be involved in this case. This is
It's going through the FISA?
Now, how many would be turned down by a judge when you present a warrant for foreign intelligence? Very few, because you only have to prove two things: foreign power agent and foreign power. So very few. Some are, but in the old days with the different technology, you only had to prove one or two things. Now, lots of warrants are turned down for criminal reasons because you haven't presented adequate evidence for probable cause for the judge to be convinced.
And have any of the agencies been sued for the violation of civil liberties?
Probably so. I've been personally sued. Usually there's a suit and the Justice Department takes over and you sort of let that play out. But I'm sure there have been suits. I don't know of anything moving to the Supreme Court or anything.
We have a question from the audience. What are your thoughts on the allegations of Russian tampering in the U.S. election? Jessica, why don't you start with that one?
I mean, this is something that is, not going away, and that I think that one thing that Eli said and one thing that both Admiral McConnell said struck me as something that I think is important to point out here. When we have all of these leaks, when we have, we've seen an erosion of confidence in our institutions. And I think that applies to Congress, that applies to the media, certainly, and that's applied to the intelligence agency. And we've seen over the past election and the president even saying disparaging things about the intelligence agency. And those are things that are hard to repair. And, other people can speak certainly to that. But, with Russia, I mean, there is sufficient evidence, according to FBI Director Comey, that there is enough to at least open an investigation. I was showing them on my phone, actually, right before we got here. There was a Washington Post story that just came out where there was a FISA warrant for surveillance against Carter Page, who was an foreign policy advisor. The scope of his the scope of how much he was advising the Trump campaign is up for debate, but back to, I believe it was July in the story of communications that he had with Russians. So, I mean, these, there appear to be evidence of some ties there. I think it's going to continue to go on out, but I believe it was General Ballard that said yesterday, too, I mean, what the Russians wanted to do was to continue to erode confidence in our institutions and in our democratic process itself. And to that effect, it was successful to an extent. And, it was just a fascinating thing to watch some of these, whether it was hacked emails through the DNC and, some of Clinton's emails that came out, there was more embarrassing things in those than there wasn't anything revelatory. And certainly, these were not matters of classified intelligence that we're talking about, because this is a campaign and these are more campaign strategies and different things. But, the Russians clearly believed that President Trump would be more favorable to some of their policies, and that they could, I don't know, work better with him is not a way to, but I don't know, I don't want to say manipulate either, but to, you know, in some regards have that influence over him to some degree, and I think that's why it's interesting to see how they are responding now to with the attacks in Syria and how they are going forward. Is there going to be a stronger position against Russia, or are they going to fall back on what has been historically a weaker position on Russia? Or, you know, every time that the president tweets something saying, you know, this is false, this is a false story about Russia, from the very beginning, I think that if he had come out and said, you know, we need to investigate this, the intelligence community has this information, instead of when the Washington Post had the big scoop about this, it was beginning of December. I mean, his initial response was just baffling to me, because it pointed out, well, you know, this is an agency that had failure to find weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that's just sort of low-hanging fruit. You know, we're not even talking about this. He's trying to attack the agency's credibility. And instead of, you know, he had come out and said, okay, you know, this is something we really need to investigate. We need to get to the bottom of this, instead of continually knocking down the fact that this is a reality. I think it would have saved his administration a lot of heartache and questions, but I don't think we're going to see that happen anytime soon.
Could I add just quickly? I haven't seen the story, so I don't know what the details are on a FISA warrant against Carter Page. Carter Page is a U.S. person. For FISA court to grant a warrant, they would have to convince a judge, an independent third party, that he was acting as an agent of foreign power. That's the only way you could do it. Now, might you collect information that reveals a discussion with Carter Page if he's in dialogue with a Russian target that we're targeting? You can't control who the Russian talks to. If it's Carter Page, that's called incidental collection. Now you've got to mask it, and then you go through the process to unmask it. Let me make a comment with regard to Russians targeting U.S. election. Absolutely no question in my mind. They did it deliberately. It was purposeful. They'll do it again. They'll be back again and again. They've been doing it in Europe for an extended period of time. At this moment, they're making every effort to get Le Pen elected the president of France, because they want France to pull out of the EU and go back to the franc and get out of the euro. What does that do to Europe? It starts to break down the unity that had been facing off with Russia. Looking at this from Russia's point of view, putting Putin aside as a KGB trained information manipulator operative, from Russia's point of view, they've been invaded several times pretty severely. A lot of Russians died. They lost their empire and they want it back, and they see the U.S. leading NATO and Europe as the reason for that, so they're going after it. So it's no question in my mind they're being very, very aggressive, particularly under Putin.
And if it becomes documented truth that this happened, are you surprised that this is the first time it's happened?
No, it's been going on for a long time. They've tried a lot of things. The big difference is they've run information campaigns forever. The big difference is social media and the internet. You can sit in Moscow and reach into the DNC. That's what I find a lot of people don't fully appreciate. You can be anywhere on the globe. If you ask how many networks are there in the world, most people start arguing, well, 10,000, a million, what? There's one. There's one global network. So wherever you are, if you can get the access to the public switch network, you go wherever you want. And if you're sophisticated, you can open it up and take the information. So they went into the DNC, they took out what turned out to be embarrassing information, and they exposed it. And they'll do it again and again. They'll do it in Germany, they'll do it in France, they'll do it in England, they'll do it in Holland or wherever, because they want to fracture the EU and NATO.
Mike?
If you look at unclassified Russian publications over the last 5 years, it's abundantly obvious that they view, the official view of information warfare is that it's on a par with traditional hardware, tanks, planes, guns, things like that. It is an integral part of their war mindset. It's a legitimate battlefield, and it's a cheap one too. So when you've got a second-rate military that's really good at pushing around third and fourth-rate neighbors, but would be no match against a more sophisticated military, when you have an economy that's dependent on a shaky oil economy and a declining demographic situation, you have to play your strongest card. And for them, it's exactly what we're talking about right now. It's that information warfare piece. They did what they did for less than the cost of a battle tank, I would wager. That's a pretty good return on investment.
If I could add one thing too, because Admiral McConnell touched on social media, because I mean there were the emails, but we've learned since too that this was a very sophisticated operation to they knew almost what states were in play and where to focus, and you had Russian bots being created that could be masked as though they were a white male in Wisconsin and spreading information and doing that. I mean, to the level to which it got so specific is fascinating to me. And I think it goes back to the erosion of confidence in our institutions, the prevalence of fake news, that it was just so easy to share these things, and that people on social media, I think social media it's opened a Pandora's box. I think in many ways it is a wonderful thing. It makes people more accessible. It's easier to share information. For me as a journalist, it is a critical news gathering tool. It is how we can engage people. But, when it is spreading disinformation, when it is a platform for hate and for just awful things that I saw this election, that is what I think it continues to, undermine civility. I think it undermines democracy. And when you have news stories, we've talked about how critical the free press is to democracy. And when you have news stories out there that are false, I think that undermines American democracy as well.
What it says to me is the U.S. Press, which I absolutely believe in 1,000%, has to realize you're not going to put this genie back in the box. You got to go faster. You got to do fact check. You got to be out front to lead on this issue, because technology does not go backwards. The world is now a smaller place. I go back to what I said earlier. It's 30 milliseconds from Tokyo to New York. That's around the world in less than a second. So you've got to go fast and do a lot of different things that we're not doing right now.
And I would say too, I mean, I think that there has sort of been a moment of reckoning, I think, in journalism too. I think that this campaign is forced us to try to figure out how to deal with the evolution of these different things. I know, I've spoken to several classes here over the past few days about this, but, at NPR, I think it's made us just realize, people want facts. There is an appetite for that, and there is an appetite for transparency of how you get that, and it has sort of redoubled our mission at NPR, and that's why I'm really proud to be a part of it, of how do we fact check, how are we doing live annotating events and showing people in real time, trying to put it into context. We show them the sources that we get, and I think when you are very transparent in that regard, it continues to, I think, breed trust. Can the media do a lot better? Absolutely. I think it is an ongoing battle, but I think that, for better or for worse, we have had to evolve, but I think it's also sort of had to made us have to sort of go back to those first principles of journalism too.
Maurice?
Yeah, I mean, I would touch on it from the light of premised in the essence of when I say I worked at the Situation Room, people are like, oh, the Situation is so cool, right? And the imagination soars. But the Situation Room was established because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs. So there was a failure that happened because JFK did not have real-time information. So there's a key word of real-time, and what does that mean? And what it meant to me as even when I'm sitting in Iraq as a soldier, as an airman in the Air Force, as a tech sergeant in the Air Force, I heavily relied on the intel that was given to my commanders and their commanders to pass down to us. When I was in the Situation Room, I relied on the intel and the accuracy of that intel when I traveled to over 40-plus countries in support of the situation, in support of the principals at the White House who were going to travel with me and end up in my room getting briefed. So those security briefs before I left, I heavily relied on them being accurate and in real time, accurate enough to make sure I knew that these threats were there, counterintelligence was going to happen, and I was traveling in an official capacity, and I was safe. So we all can agree that we want our troops to be safe, so the real time of that information needs to be prevalent. And there's also a key word in the military we call need to know. There's a reason for need to know. There's a reason for real time. Those things together create a safety and a safety net and a safe haven for that soldier to protect and keep that fight wherever it is and not on the doorstep of our mothers and our sisters and our brothers and our fathers and our mothers. With that being said, even as a civilian, if I'm traveling to a country, because I love to travel, right? A lot of people love to travel. The pursuit of happiness, that's the United States creed. When you're going to travel to a country that may require a visa, the embassy in some cases will give you the opportunity to get a security brief. And you might want to use that and heed that knowledge and heed that intel that was given to you as a civilian to make sure you're not in harm's way when you're traveling in these nations that you want to explore that might not respect our way of living, our ethos, and things of that nature. So I would say I relied on the intel of the intel community, not only because I had a clearance level that gave me privy to the information that would make sure that I would be out of harm's way conducting a mission that was a need-to-know purpose for someone in the White House to make sure they got their job done across the seas to in fact, protect us at home. But even as a civilian, I would want to know that the people that are looking out for me have my best interests in mind, and they're doing it and they're getting that information in real time. And that requires some surveillance. And without that surveillance, we're not protected. So that transparency in many ways is a failure of that rule of need to know. Not everyone needs to know that when North Korea did something and in the islands of Sapporo, there was a ship waiting that was posted there to make sure that we were going to be the first responders. That it wasn't in the news back here, right? But that happened. So those need-to-know things and that real-time information is necessary. So JFK could have probably had a successful pursuit of Fidel Castro then. So that's my.
Would it surprise any of you if in coming weeks or months it was revealed that the United States is trying to influence elections with electronic communications?
Nope.
No?
No. I'd be surprised if I learned that we were going to the extremes that Russia went to in our election. I think ours is more of the old-fashioned ham-handed propaganda. Just my 2 cents worth.
Any others want to speak to that? To what extent
Depends on-
everybody's doing it, just as we talked earlier about?
Depends on where, if you could do it someplace like Iran or North Korea. If we could effectively do it, we'd do it in a heartbeat. If we wouldn't do it in a democratic society. We would not. I just wouldn't be appropriate. I can give, just to make, we're getting close to the end, let me help the audience understand my community. And General Ballard will vouch for this. Anytime there's a crisis and there's a huge set of worry and it comes to closure, there are 3 potential outcomes for a national crisis. There's a policy success, there's an operational success, or there's an intelligence failure. You always hear about what didn't go right. You never hear about what you did right. So that's just a way to think about it going forward.
We have to conclude tonight, and we very much appreciate your being with us and also being very engaged with your questions. And obviously, the Riley Institute will continue to generate programming of national significance for the Greenville community. So please stay tuned. Thank you all.